Dust swirled through Redemption Creek as Ellen Collins stood trembling, wrists raw against iron chains that bound her to the wagon wheel. Her crime, refusing to marry the cattle baron's son. The cowboys laughed, passing a bottle between them, their cruelty as casual as their contempt. Townfolk watched from doorways and windows, silent, ashamed, but too afraid to intervene. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street when a figure emerged from the alleyway. 6'7" of pure Apache warrior, his face weathered like the mountains he called home. The crowd fell silent as he approached with the quiet confidence of a man who feared nothing. Could one man's courage change the fate of an entire town caught in the grip of tyranny? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Redemption Creek wasn't always a town ruled by fear. Old-timers could still recall when the Silver Strike brought hope instead of hardship. Sheriff Thomas Wilson sat at his desk, turning the worn brass key to the jail cell between his weathered fingers. Once a symbol of fair justice, now just another tool in James Harrington's belt. The sheriff glanced at his reflection in the window. 58 years had carved deep lines around his eyes, each one earned from squinting into the sun, and lately from looking away when he should have stood tall. His once proud mustache had gone grey, much like his convictions. "Another fine morning in paradise," Doc Miller remarked dryly, stepping through the office door. The town physician carried his black bag, knuckles white around the handle. "Thought you might want to know they've had that girl chained up since dawn." Wilson didn't meet his old friend's eyes. "Harrington says it's a lesson." "A lesson?" Doc's voice hardened. "She's 19, Thomas. All she did was decline a proposal. Victor Harrington doesn't get told no," the sheriff replied, the words tasting bitter. "Not in his daddy's town." Outside Redemption Creek's main street baked under the midday sun. Once bright storefronts had faded like the town's spirit. Martha Jenkins swept the boardwalk in front of her general store, pausing to watch a group of Harrington's cowboys swagger down the street. She was 62 and had buried her husband 3 winters ago, but her spine remained as straight as her gaze was direct. "Morning, Widow Jenkins," called one rider, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Fine day to teach some manners, ain't it?" Miss Martha's lips pressed into a thin line as she continued sweeping, each stroke more forceful than necessary. At the far end of town, the white steeple of Redemption Creek's only church pointed skyward like an accusing finger. Inside, Preacher Collins knelt before the altar, his prayers urgent whispers. "Lord, give me strength," he begged, hands trembling. "My Ellen needs me, but I'm afraid." The preacher was 65, his faith tested more in the past 5 years than in all the decades before. When Harrington bought the failing bank and foreclosed on half the businesses in town, Preacher Collins had counseled patience and prayer. When Harrington's men drove 3 families off their land by damming the creek that watered their crops, he had quoted scripture about turning the other cheek. But this was his daughter, his only child. The key in Sheriff Wilson's hand caught the sunlight as he finally placed it back in the drawer. He strapped on his gun belt with deliberate slowness. The weight of the revolver felt heavier these days, though he rarely drew it anymore. Not since Harrington's men started wearing star-shaped deputy badges that the cattle baron had ordered from back east. "You know it ain't right, Thomas," Doc Miller said quietly. "The whole town knows it ain't right." "And what would you have me do?" Wilson's voice cracked. "Harrington owns the bank, the mines, most of the water. He's got 15 guns on his payroll." "I remember when that badge meant something to you," Doc replied, nodding toward the tarnished star on Wilson's chest. The sheriff's fingers brushed the badge. Once, he'd polished it daily. Now the metal was dulled by neglect, much like the law it represented. "There was a time," Wilson admitted, "when I would have stood between any citizen of this town and harm, no matter who was doing the harming. That time has passed." Wilson had no answer, as memories washed over him. 10 years ago, he'd faced down 3 cattle rustlers alone. 7 years back, he'd ridden through a blizzard to bring medicine when scarlet fever threatened the schoolhouse. But 3 years ago, when Harrington's son beat a miner nearly to death for speaking to the wrong woman, Sheriff Wilson had written it up as a drunken fall. The sound of laughter drifted through the open window, harsh, cruel laughter from the crowd gathering to watch Ellen Collins's humiliation. "They say an Apache's been watching from the shadows," Doc said suddenly. "Big fellow, been in town 3 days." Wilson frowned. "Harrington won't take kindly to that. Maybe that's exactly what this town needs," Doc replied. "Someone who doesn't care what James Harrington takes kindly to." Sheriff Wilson strapped on his gun belt and reached for his hat. The badge caught one last ray of sunlight, a brief reminder of oaths long forgotten. Ellen Collins had her mother's eyes, deep blue like mountain lakes, observant and kind. What she didn't inherit was her mother's cautious nature. Sarah Collins had been measured in all things before consumption claimed her 5 winters ago. She'd taught her daughter to survive in a man's world by bending like a willow. Ellen had learned a different lesson from watching her mother fade. Life was too precious to spend in fear. Standing chained to the wagon wheel, Ellen clutched the silver thimble hidden in her dress pocket. The last gift from her mother, worn smooth from years of mending the community's garments. A lady's armor, her mother had called it, pressing it into Ellen's palm during those final fevered days. Sunday service had been unusually crowded 3 days ago. Word had spread that Victor Harrington meant to make an announcement. Ellen had known what was coming. Victor's possessive gaze had followed her for months. His gifts arrived unwanted, a garish brooch, an expensive hat from San Francisco, a pair of riding gloves. Though she didn't own a horse, each returned, each followed by something larger. "Friends and neighbors," Victor had proclaimed, standing uninvited at the pulpit while her father watched with nervous eyes. "Today I ask for Ellen Collins' hand in marriage, with her father's blessing." The congregation had turned to stare, expectant smiles fixed on their faces. Her father had nodded slightly, a gesture born of terror rather than approval. Ellen had risen slowly, clutching her hymnal. "Mr. Harrington," she'd said, voice clear in the hushed church, "I must decline." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a lightning strike. "Perhaps you misunderstood," Victor had replied, his smile unchanged, though his eyes hardened. "Your father and I have already discussed the arrangements." Ellen had looked to her father then, seen the defeat in his posture. The thimble in her pocket had felt suddenly heavy. "I understood perfectly," she'd answered. "My hand is not my father's to give, nor yours to claim. I will not marry you, Mr. Harrington. Not today, not ever." She'd heard Martha Jenkins' soft gasp, seen Doc Miller's barely concealed smile. Most faces showed only shock. No one refused a Harrington in Redemption Creek. Victor's humiliation had curdled quickly to rage. He'd stormed from the church, knocking over a collection plate. The coins had scattered across the floorboards like falling stars. That night her father had paced their small home behind the church. "You've doomed us both," he'd whispered. "They'll take everything. The church, our home. Would you have me marry a man I despise?" Ellen had asked, working the silver thimble between her fingers. "I would have you live," her father had answered, suddenly looking every day of his 65 years. "Victor Harrington collects things, Ellen, things he can't have most of all." Dawn had barely broken when the pounding came at their door. 4 of Harrington's men, Victor watching from horseback. "Public lesson in manners," the foreman had announced, binding Ellen's wrists. Despite her father's pleas, now the sun stood high, and Ellen's shoulders ached from the awkward position. The chains allowed her to sit or stand, but little else. Townsfolk passed with averted eyes. Some women left water or bread when Victor's men weren't watching. "Your mama would be ashamed of this town," Martha Jenkins murmured, pretending to adjust Ellen's shawl while slipping her a strip of dried beef. "But mighty proud of you, girl." Victor approached on horseback around midday, his men gathering to watch the spectacle. "Changed your mind yet?" he called, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Say yes, and I'll have you released. We can be married by sunset." Helen's throat was dry, her wrists raw, but she found her mother's thimble in her pocket and drew strength from its familiar shape. "I would sooner marry this wagon wheel, Mr. Harrington." The cowboys hooted with laughter, enjoying the entertainment. Victor's face darkened as he dismounted, approaching until his shadow fell across her. "Stubborn fool," he hissed. "By tomorrow you'll be begging." "I've never begged for anything in my life," Helen replied. "I don't intend to start now." Victor raised his hand as if to strike her. Helen didn't flinch, her fingers tight around the silver thimble. The sound of approaching footsteps made Victor pause. A tall figure moved toward them with unhurried confidence, and in that moment, Helen Collins realized she wasn't the only one in Redemption Creek who refused to bend. They called him Takoda, though he answered to other names depending on which world he walked in. His Apache mother had given him his true name, meaning friend to all in the old tongue. The missionaries who raised him after the cavalry raid had called him Thomas. To most white settlers, he was simply the Indian, a label that erased both his complexity and his humanity. Takoda moved with deliberate calm, each step purposeful as he approached the scene in the town center. The eagle feather braided into his hair was a reminder of a vision quest taken years ago, when the great bird had shown him a path between worlds. Neither fully Apache nor embraced by white society, he had made this boundary existence his strength, rather than his burden. 3 days in Redemption Creek had told him everything he needed to know about the rot at the town's core. He'd watched from shadows as Harrington's men collected protection money from shopkeepers. He'd observed the sheriff's slumped shoulders and averted gaze when injustice occurred before him. He'd seen good people made small by fear. Takoda had not come to Redemption Creek by chance. Rumors of a silver-rich valley once sacred to his mother's people had drawn him, whispers of ancestors' bones disturbed by mining operations. He'd meant only to observe, perhaps to reclaim small artifacts of his heritage before continuing his solitary journey. Then he'd witnessed Helen Collins' defiance in the church. "No man owns my future," she had declared, standing straight back before Victor Harrington. The words had stirred something in Takoda's chest. For 20 years he'd wandered the changing frontier, belonging nowhere, fighting others' battles for temporary shelter or meager payment. The cavalry had employed his tracking skills while calling him half-breed behind his back. Mining operations had hired his strong back while paying him half a white man's wage. At 45, the lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into distant horizons, always searching for what? He had stopped asking himself. Takoda's hand moved to the medicine bag at his waist, fingers finding the smooth thoth of the stone pipe within. His father had carved it from red stone, the bowl shaped like a buffalo. Before the raid that separated them forever, his father had pressed it into his hands. "Remember who you are," his father had told him, "not what they say you are." Now, watching Helen Collins stand defiant, despite her chains, Takoda felt an unfamiliar sensation, recognition. Here was someone else who refused to be defined by others' expectations. Victor Harrington's raised hand froze as Takoda's shadow fell across the tableau. The cowboys shifted nervously, hands instinctively moving toward holstered weapons. Even in civilized towns like Redemption Creek, an Apache warrior inspired primal fear among those who had grown up on frontier tales. And Takoda knew how he appeared to them. 6'7" and broad-shouldered, hair worn long in the Apache way but clothes a mixture of white man's practical garments and traditional elements. The scars on his forearms told stories of battles survived. The quiet confidence in his eyes spoke of a man who had faced death and found it lacking. "This matter doesn't concern you, Indian," Victor said, recovering his composure. "Move along." Takoda didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept the scene, the woman's raw wrists, the water bucket left just out of her reach, the townspeople watching from a distance with shame evident in their postures. Water denied to a thirsty soul, Takoda finally said, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. Chains on the innocent. These concern any man with eyes to see. He reached slowly for the water bucket, aware of how every cowboy tensed. With deliberate movements, he brought the ladle to Eleanor's lips, allowing her to drink deep. "I said this doesn't concern you," Victor repeated, his hand now resting on his holstered pistol. "Do you know who I am?" Takoda's expression remained impassive as he set the bucket down within Eleanor's reach. "I know what you are," he replied evenly. A small man casting a large shadow because the sun is low. A ripple of nervous laughter from the gathering crowd was quickly silenced by Victor's glare. "Step away from her," Victor commanded, drawing his pistol halfway from its holster. Takoda stood his ground, his hand returning to the medicine pipe in his pouch. "I will not." Victor Harrington's face flushed with an ugly crimson as he fully drew his custom Colt revolver. The sandalwood grip gleamed with an inlaid silver X, a gift from his father on his 25th birthday. To Victor, the weapon was more than protection. It was proof of his importance, an extension of his authority. "Last chance, Indian," Victor snarled, cocking the hammer with an exaggerated flourish. "Walk away or they'll bury what's left of you in the bone orchard." Takoda remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Victor's. The gathering crowd grew still, the only sounds the jingle of tack from the nervous horses and the labored breathing of an increasingly agitated Victor. "Victor?" Sheriff Wilson's voice cut through the tension as he approached with hurried steps. "Put that away before someone gets hurt." "Stay out of this, Sheriff," Victor replied without looking away from Takoda. "This savage is interfering with a private matter." "Chaining a woman in the public square ain't private," the sheriff countered, his hand hovering near his own weapon. The weight of his neglected responsibilities seemed suddenly heavier than the gun at his hip. Ellen Collins watched the scene unfold with widening eyes. "Please," she whispered to Takoda, "don't risk yourself for me." Takoda gave no indication he'd heard her plea. His focus remained entirely on Victor, whose gun hand had developed a slight tremor. "Your weapon speaks of wealth," Takoda observed calmly, "but your eyes speak of fear. Which should I believe?" Victor's grip tightened on the sandalwood handle. "I fear nothing, especially no reservation runaway. A man confident in his strength has no need to display it," Takoda replied. 3 of Victor's cowboys had fanned out, creating a loose semicircle behind their boss. Their hands rested on their weapons, but uncertainty marked their expression. They'd signed on to intimidate farmers and townspeople, not to face a warrior who showed no trace of fear. "Mr. Harrington," Sheriff Wilson tried again, "your father wouldn't want. My father would expect me to defend what's mine." Victor snapped. "I am not yours," Ellen interjected, pulling against her chains. "I never will be." Victor's attention shifted to her for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. With speed that seemed impossible for a man of his Takoda closed the distance between them. His left hand clamped around Victor's wrist, while his right twisted the revolver from the younger man's grasp. The crowd gasped collectively as Takoda stepped back, now holding Victor's prized weapon. "Draw on me," Victor commanded his men, his voice cracking with humiliation. "Shoot him." The cowboys exchanged uncertain glances, none willing to be the first to fire. Takoda had made no threatening move beyond disarming Victor. The revolver dangled from his fingertips, pointed at the ground. "This," Takoda said, studying the ornate weapon, "is a boy's toy, made for show, not use." With deliberate movements he ejected the bullets onto the dusty street, then tossed the empty gun at Victor's feet. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the onlookers. Victor's face contorted with rage as he scrambled to retrieve his revolver, dignity forgot. "You're dead," he hissed, brushing dust from the sandalwood grip. Your father is right here," came a new voice, deep and commanding. The crowd parted as James Harrington approached on horseback. Unlike his son, the cattle baron affected a modest appearance. Simple black coat, well-worn hat, unadorned saddle, At 68, his face was weathered like old leather, his silver-streaked beard neatly trimmed. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, calculating and cold as a winter creek. "What's this disturbance about, Victor?" Harrington asked, dismounting with the fluid ease of a lifelong horseman. Before Victor could respond, Sheriff Wilson stepped forward. "Just a misunderstanding, Mr. Harrington. I was about to resolve it." "Were you indeed?" Harrington's gaze traveled from the sheriff to Dakota, then to Elaine and her chains. "It appears there's a great deal of resolving happening in my town today." "Your town?" Dakota questioned quietly. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Dakota. "You're new to Redemption Creek. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Some things require no introduction," Dakota replied, gesturing toward Elaine. "Cruelty wears the same face everywhere." A faint smile touched Harrington's lips, never reaching his eyes, philosophical as well as bold. "Interesting." He turned to his son. "Victor, we have business at the ranch. This spectacle can wait." "But father..." "Now, Victor." Victor glared at Dakota, clutching his empty revolver. "This isn't finished." "No," Dakota agreed. "It is just beginning." James Harrington removed his riding gloves with practiced precision, one finger at a time. Crafted from the finest Spanish leather and embossed with his cattle brand, they were supple from years of wear yet showed no signs of hard labor. Like everything in Harrington's life, they served both function and appearance, practical tools that simultaneously displayed his status. "Sheriff," Harrington said, his tone pleasant but firm, "remove those chains from Miss Collins. Such displays lack subtlety." Sheriff Wilson blinked in surprise but quickly moved to unlock Elena's restraints. The gathered townspeople murmured among themselves, uncertain whether to feel relief or deeper concern at this unexpected mercy. "Don't mistake me," Harrington continued, addressing the crowd as much as Elaine. "Justice must be served when young ladies forget their manners. But perhaps public humiliation isn't the most effective teacher." His cold gaze shifted to Dakota. "What do your people believe about justice, sir?" "My people believe the measure of justice depends on whose hand holds the scale," Dakota replied. A thin smile creased Harrington's weathered face. "Quite so, and in Redemption Creek, that hand is mine." He flexed his fingers within the gloves, the leather creaking softly. "You've shown yourself to be a man of uncommon abilities. Few would dare to challenge my son. Fewer still would succeed." Ellen rubbed her raw wrists as the chains fell away. "Mr. Harrington, I've done nothing to deserve punishment. Declining a proposal isn't a crime." "Perhaps not by statute," Harrington conceded, "but social harmony requires certain expectations be met." He returned his attention to Dakota. "You seem concerned with the lady's welfare. Are you willing to stand for her?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Dakota studied Harrington, recognizing the calculation behind his seemingly reasonable demeanor. "I stand for what is right," Dakota answered carefully. "Noble sentiments," Harrington nodded. "But in my experience, principles without consequences are merely words." "I propose a wager, sir." Victor, who had been seething quietly, stepped forward. "Father, you can't seriously." Harrington silenced his son with a sharp gesture, never taking his eyes off Dakota. "A contest. 3 trials of skill and strength. Should you prevail, the lady goes free, her debt to society considered paid. Should you fail," his eyes glinted, "you worked for me for 1 year. Fair compensation for the disruption you've caused." Doc Miller pushed through the crowd. "Don't agree to anything, mister. Harrington never makes a bet he can't win." "Slander, Doctor," Harrington chuckled, removing his right glove and extending his bare hand toward Dakota. "What say you? Are your convictions strong enough to risk your freedom?" Dakota made no move to accept the handshake. "And if I decline, then Miss Collins will face proper legal charges for her disturbance at Sunday service. Disruption of worship carries significant penalties in this territory." Harrington's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes had hardened. Sheriff Wilson would have no choice but to enforce the law. The sheriff studied his boots, shame evident in his posture. Ellen stepped forward despite her weakness from hours chained in the sun. "Don't do this. He'll cheat. He always does." Harrington's expression tightened momentarily before he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. Opening it, he removed 2 six-sided dice carved from bone, yellowed with age and use. "My father's dice," he explained, holding them up for all to see. "I've carried them for 40 years. We'll let chance be our witness." He rolled them in his palm. "Even numbers. The Apache accepts my challenge. Odd numbers. Miss Collins faces the law." Before anyone could object, Harrington cast the dice onto the hard-packed dirt. They tumbled and settled, a 4 and a 6. "Fortune has spoken," Harrington declared, scooping up the dice and returning them to their pouch. "The trials begin tomorrow at my ranch. Sunrise." He pulled his glove back on with the same methodical care with which he'd removed it. "Sheriff, ensure our visitor has suitable accommodations tonight. We wouldn't want him missing his appointment." "I don't need supervision," Dakota stated. "Of course not," Harrington smiled. "But Redemption Creek values its guests, especially those who've made such binding commitments." Mounting his horse, Harrington tipped his hat to Elaine. "Miss Collins, I trust we've seen the last of your public rebellions. Victor, come." With that, he turned his horse and rode toward the outskirts of town, his son following reluctantly. "You shouldn't have interfered," Elaine told Dakota when the Harringtons were out of earshot. "Now you're caught in their game too. Some games change when new players join," Dakota replied, watching the retreating figures. "And some cages are visible only to those outside them." Sheriff Fillon cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm afraid I'll need to escort you to the jailhouse, mister. For your own protection, you understand." Dakota nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I understand many things, Sheriff, including that dice can be weighted to show what their owner desires." The corral at Harrington Ranch stretched wide beneath the morning sun, its rough-hewn posts weathered by seasons of wind and rain. The branding iron hanging beside the gate bore the distinctive Flying H mark that adorned every Harrington steer from Redemption Creek to the Kansas border. Normally used to claim ownership of livestock, today it seemed to announce Harrington's claim on all who entered his domain. A sizable crowd had gathered to witness the contest. Townsfolk stood in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Harrington's Cowboys lounged against the fence with performative casualness, though their eyes remained alert. On a raised platform stood James Harrington himself, Victor sulking at his side. Nearby, under the watchful eye of Sheriff Wilson, waited Ellen Collins and her father. Dakota arrived on foot, a solitary figure approaching from the direction of town. He wore the same clothes as the previous day, showing no signs of discomfort despite having spent the night in Sheriff Wilson's jail cell. "Welcome to my home," Harrington called out, arms spread in a gesture of false hospitality. "I trust you slept well." Dakota acknowledged the greeting with a slight nod, but offered no response to the veiled mockery. "The terms remain as discussed," Harrington continued. 3 trials, succeed, and Miss Collins is free of all obligations. Fail, and you work for me for 1 year. He gestured toward the corral. "The first test is simple enough. 2 horses need breaking, wild stock from the North Range. Whoever handles them most effectively wins." On cue, Harrington's foreman and another wrangler led 2 Mustangs into the corral, one a dappled gray, the other a fierce-eyed chestnut. Both animals paced nervously, nostrils flared and ears pinned back. "Victor will demonstrate the Harrington method first," James announced. Victor removed his jacket and handed it to a waiting ranch hand. Beneath it he wore an embroidered vest and a silk neckerchief, hardly appropriate attire for breaking wild horses. From a nearby post, he retrieved a pair of silver spurs, fastening them to his boots with practiced movements. The silver jingle bobs made a musical sound as he walked, announcing his approach like the warning rattle of a snake. The spurs were ornate affairs, their rowels nearly 2 inches in diameter, with 8 sharp points on each. These were not the practical tools of a working rancher, but instruments of domination designed to draw blood at the slightest provocation. "My grandfather's spurs," Victor announced, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "never failed to tame the wildest bronc." Ellen watched with visible disgust. "Those aren't for training," she murmured to her father. "They're for hurting." Victor entered the corral with an exaggerated swagger. The grey Mustang was released first, circling the enclosure with wary steps. Using a combination of intimidation and painful jabs from the spurs, Victor managed to mount the horse and stay seated through its initial protests. Each time the animal bucked, Victor dug the spurs deep into its flanks, drawing small streams of blood that darkened its dappled coat. After 3 minutes of brutal riding, the exhausted horse stood trembling, its spirit temporarily broken. Victor dismounted to scattered applause from his father's men and uncomfortable silence from the townspeople. "Your turn, Apache," Victor called, spurs jingling as he strutted from the corral. "Try not to embarrass yourself." Dakota stepped forward, removing his worn leather vest and placing it carefully on a fence post. His muscled arms bore the scars of a life lived without compromise. Before entering the corral, he knelt and removed his boots, choosing to proceed barefoot. "What's he doing?" someone whispered in the crowd. "Saying a prayer, maybe," another answered. "He'll need it with that devil horse." The chestnut Mustang was released, more aggressive than the gray had been. It charged immediately, forcing Dakota to sidestep with the fluid grace of a seasoned fighter. Instead of reaching for a rope or whip, Dakota simply stood his ground, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to the spectators. For several minutes he made no attempt to mount, instead moving around the corral in a pattern that seemed random to observers, but gradually decreased the horse's agitation. The Mustang's ears, initially flattened in fear and anger, slowly rose to an attentive position. When Dakota finally approached the animal directly, he moved with deliberate calm. He placed a hand on its sweating neck, then smoothly mounted in a single motion. The horse tensed but didn't buck. Within minutes, Dakota was guiding it around the corral with subtle shifts of his weight, no spurs or whip required. A murmur of appreciation passed through the crowd. Even some of Harrington's men nodded in reluctant respect. "Impressive," James Harrington acknowledged when Dakota dismounted. "But efficiency matters in ranching. My son broke his horse in half the time." "He broke more than the horse," Dakota replied, glancing at the still trembling gray with its bloodied flanks. "What's built on fear stands only until fear finds a greater master." Victor's face darkened. "Fine words from a man who'll be mucking stalls for my father. Come sundown." Harrington raised a hand to silence his son. "One trial completed. The second awaits." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I suggest you rest while my men prepare it. You'll need your strength." As Dakota left the corral, Ellen stepped forward despite her father's restraining hand. "That was kindness, not weakness," she said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Something this ranch hasn't seen in many years." Martha Jenkins had never considered herself a rebel. At 62, with hair more silver than brown and hands gnarled from decades of work, she presented the picture of a proper frontier widow. Her general store had served Redemption Creek for 30 years, surviving drought, economic downturns, and James Harrington's systematic takeover of the town. What few knew was that beneath the store's weathered floorboards lay her most treasured possession, a leather-bound journal where her late husband had meticulously recorded every significant event in Redemption Creek's history. Samuel Jenkins had been the town's first schoolteacher and unofficial chronicler until consumption claimed him 3 winters past. As Martha arranged canned goods on her shelves, the bell above the door announced a customer. Doc Miller entered, removing his hat and brushing dust from his coat. "Word spreading about the Apache," he said without preamble. "They say he gentled that wild Mustang like he was speaking its language." Martha nodded, making a note in her inventory ledger. Samuel would have appreciated that. He always said true strength needs no cruelty to prove itself. Doc glanced around the empty store before lowering his voice. Harrington's planning something for the second trial. His foreman was in the saloon last night, hiring men from downriver. Rough sorts. Stacking the odds, Martha murmured, unsurprised. That's always been James's way. Remember when he arranged for the bank examiner to be delayed while he moved funds between accounts? This town's been dying by inches since he arrived. Doc agreed. First the bank, then the mines. Now even Sheriff Wilson jumps at his shadow. Martha closed her ledger with a decisive snap. Perhaps it's time we remembered who we were before Harrington. She moved to the counter and withdrew a small tin box. Opening it revealed a collection of smooth river stones, each marked with a simple cross. Samuel's voting stones, Doc recognized, from when the town council still meant something. One stone, one voice, Martha confirmed, running a finger over the worn markers. Samuel kept them to remind us that every person in this community matters. She selected one and pressed it into Doc's palm. It's time to count again. Doc stared at the stone. Count what exactly? Those willing to stand, Martha replied, her voice steady. I'm not suggesting we face down Harrington's guns, but perhaps we stop turning away. Perhaps we bear witness. To what end? Doc asked, though his fingers closed around the stone. To remind ourselves who we are, Martha answered. Samuel used to say a community is like a quilt. Each piece may seem small and insignificant, but together they provide warmth and protection. Throughout the day, Martha distributed the stones discreetly, to Preacher Collins when he came for coffee, to the blacksmith's wife buying flour, to the elderly Simmons brothers who ran the livery. Each stone passed with a simple message. Remember who we were. Watch the second trial. Stand together. By evening, Martha counted stones missing from her tin. 12 souls willing to at least consider resistance. It wasn't much in a town of over 100, but it was a beginning. As she closed the store, Sheriff Wilson appeared at her counter, looking more haggard than usual. Evening, Thomas, Martha greeted him. Late for shopping, aren't you? Wilson removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. Not shopping, Martha. Warning. Harrington's men are watching who comes and goes from your store. They're making notes. Martha continued counting the day's earnings, her expression unchanged. Am I breaking some law by selling sugar and coffee? You know that's not it, Wilson sighed. There's talk about stones being passed, about people gathering to support the Apache. Takoda, Martha corrected. His name is Takoda. Wilson's eyes widened slightly at her knowledge of the Apache's name. Martha, please, don't make yourself a target. Harrington won't hesitate. To what, Thomas? Martha interrupted, fixing him with a steady gaze. Burn my store. Run me out of town. Take what little I have left. He's already done his worst redemption creek. Not his worst, Wilson said quietly. I've seen what happens to towns that truly cross him. Martha reached beneath the counter and placed one of the marked stones before the sheriff. Then perhaps it's time you decided which side of that crossing you stand on. Wilson stared at the stone but didn't touch it. It's not that simple. It never is, Martha agreed. But Samuel used to say that when good people convince themselves that doing nothing is safer than doing something, evil has already won. The sheriff's weathered face reflected decades of compromises, each small surrender etched in the lines around his eyes. The second trial is tomorrow at noon. Shooting contest at the North Meadow. Thank you for the information, Martha said, neither accepting nor rejecting his implicit warning. As Wilson turned to leave, he paused at the door. Martha, be careful, please. I'm just an old woman running a store, Thomas, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. But even old women remember what it means to stand tall. After the sheriff left, Martha took Samuel's journal from its hiding place and made a new entry. Today, 12 stones found new hands. It's a start. The North Meadow stretched wide beneath the midday sun, golden grasses swaying in the gentle breeze. At its far edge, where meadow met forest, Harrington's men had erected a series of targets at varying distances. Crude human silhouettes painted on canvas, tin cans balanced on fence posts, and glass bottles hanging from tree branches created a challenging shooting gallery. James Harrington surveyed the scene from beneath the shade of a hastily constructed canopy, seated in a chair that a throne more than practical frontier furniture. Carved from dark oak with H monograms worked into the armrests, the chair had been transported by Wagon specifically for this occasion. It spoke volumes about how Harrington viewed himself not merely as a wealthy rancher, but as the rightful ruler of all he served. An impressive course, Sheriff Wilson commented as he joined the gathering crowd. Though a bit elaborate for a simple contest, nothing is simple when honor is at stake, Harrington replied, gesturing for a ranch hand to bring the sheriff a drink. We Harringtons believe in proper ceremony. The crowd from town had grown since the previous day. Martha Jenkins stood with Doc Miller and several others who had received her stones. Ellen Collins and her father remained under the watchful eye of two cowboys, though their guard seemed less vigilant than before. Victor Harrington paced near the shooting line, checking and rechecking a pair of ornate pistols. Each bore elaborate silver inlays and custom pearl grips, the metal polished to mirror brightness. His face still carried the shadow of humiliation from the previous day's contest. Dakota arrived escorted by Harrington's foreman. He carried no visible weapon. Welcome to the second trial, Harrington announced, rising from his chair. A test of marksmanship, essential for any man of the frontier. The rules are straightforward. Contestants will fire at 20 targets. Highest score wins. And if there's a tie, Doc Miller called out. Harrington's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. There won't be. Victor stepped forward, spinning his pistols with a flashy flourish that drew scattered applause from Harrington's men. Ready when you are, Apache. What weapon will you use? Harrington asked Dakota, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Dakota reached behind his back and produced a simple hunting knife with a worn bone handle. Using it, he cut a branch from a nearby cottonwood. With quick, practiced movements, he stripped the bark and began shaping the wood. I prefer my own tools, he explained, working the branch with expert hands. Murmurs spread through the crowd as Dakota transformed the branch into a bow. From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew a bowstring of sinew, attaching it with practiced ease. Next came arrows, 5 slender shafts with stone heads and feathered fletching. How quaint, Victor sneered, planning to rub sticks together for fire. Dakota didn't respond to the taunt, testing the bow's pull with focused concentration. Very well, Harrington nodded. Victor will demonstrate first. Victor took position at the firing line, pistols gleaming in the sun. At his father's signal, he began firing at the targets with remarkable speed and accuracy. Tin cans flew from posts, bottles shattered, and canvas targets accumulated holes near their centers. His shooting was impressive, the result of years of practice with the best firearms money could buy. When he finished, 18 of the 20 targets showed damage. Victor holstered his pistols with another flourish, bowing to the scattered applause. Your turn, he said to Dakota, voice dripping with condescension, though I doubt stone arrowheads will do much against those bottles. Dakota stepped to the line, bow ready. The weapon looked deceptively simple, a curved branch with a string, yet in his hands it transformed into something ancient and powerful. He knocked his first arrow, drew the string to his cheek, and released in one fluid motion. The arrow struck the farthest bottle, shattering it completely. A hush fell over the crowd as Dakota continued, each shot flowing into the next, with mesmerizing grace. His final arrow split a playing card that had been nailed to a distant tree, a target most spectators hadn't even noticed. When he lowered the bow, all 20 targets had been hit, including 2 that Victor had missed entirely. Impossible, Victor sputtered, reaching for his pistols. He cheated somehow. How does one cheat at archery in full view of 50 witnesses? Martha Jenkins called out, her voice carrying surprising strength. Harrington rose from his chair, expression carefully controlled, an impressive display though somewhat unconventional. The bow was the first weapon I learned. Dakota explained. My father taught me that the arrow finds its mark only when the archer's heart is still. Superstitious nonsense, Victor snapped. Anyone can get lucky. 20 times in succession, Doc Miller challenged. That's not luck, that's mastery. Harrington raised a hand for silence. The Apache, Dakota, has won the second trial. The admission seemed to pain him physically. The final challenge will take place tomorrow. A test of endurance that will settle this matter conclusively. As the crowd began to disperse, Elaine managed to approach Dakota briefly. They won't let you win a third time, she warned in a hurried whisper. Harrington never loses, especially not in front of the whole town. Winning and losing look different depending on what's truly at stake. Dakota replied, his hands working the bow he'd created. This was never about their contest. Then what is it about? She asked. Before he could answer, Harrington's men separated them, leading Dakota back toward town, and Elaine toward her father's side. From his chair, Harrington watched the interaction with narrowed eyes, fingers drumming on the carved monograms that proclaimed his ownership of all he surveyed. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across Doc Miller's cramped back office as Martha Jenkins spread a weathered map across his examination table. Yellowed with age and frayed at the edges, the territorial survey map dated back nearly 30 years, to when Redemption Creek was little more than a name on paper and a dream in a few settlers' hearts. Samuel kept every document related to the town's founding, Martha explained, her finger tracing the carefully drawn boundaries. This was the original territorial grant, signed by Governor Matthews himself in '45. Doc Miller leaned closer, squinting through his spectacles. I've never seen this before. Few have, Martha replied. When Harrington bought the bank and started consolidating power, Samuel thought it prudent to keep certain records private. The map showed Redemption Creek and the surrounding territory in meticulous detail. Most notable was a broad swath of land marked with cross-hatching and a notation in faded ink. Joint Settlement Zone. Covenant of 1845. What exactly am I looking at? Doc asked. Martha's weathered finger tapped the cross-hatched area. The original charter established this entire valley as a shared territory. The settlers and the Apache band who summered here signed a formal agreement. The land wasn't owned, it was stewarded jointly. Doc's eyebrows rose in surprise. That can't be. Harrington has deeds to most of this valley. Deeds issued by the Territorial Land Office 15 years after this agreement was signed, Martha countered. After the Indian Wars, when few remembered or honored the original covenant. A soft knock interrupted them. Sheriff Wilson entered, removing his hat and nodding to both elders. You're taking a risk coming here, Thomas, Martha observed. I'm still sheriff, Wilson replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Checking on townspeople's welfare is my job. His eyes fell on the map. What's all this? Martha exchanged glances with Doc before answering. The truth about Redemption Creek, the truth Harrington has been burying for 20 years. As Martha explained, Wilson's expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief, and finally to a troubled recognition. If this is authentic, he said slowly, then Harrington's claim to the water rights and grazing lands, built on quicksand, Martha finished. Legally and morally, Wilson ran a hand through his thinning hair. It doesn't matter. Territorial courts won't overturn established claims based on a 30-year-old agreement with Indians who've been moved to reservations. Perhaps not, Martha conceded. But the people of this town deserve to know that Redemption Creek was founded as a place of cooperation, not domination. That before Harrington, we had a different vision. Doc Miller carefully rolled the map. Knowledge is one thing, Martha. Power is another. Harrington has guns, money, and the territorial governor's ear. And we have what? Wilson asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The truth, Martha replied simply, and perhaps a man who can help us remember what that means. The Apache, Wilson frowned. Dakota, he's just passing through. After tomorrow's trial, he'll either leave or become Harrington's property. Unless he wins, Doc pointed out. Harrington won't let that happen, Wilson countered. Not with so many people watching. Tomorrow's endurance trial will be rigged beyond any possible victory. Martha's eyes narrowed with sudden determination. Then we need to speak with Dakota tonight. And we need to show him this map. That would be interfering with Harrington's contest, Wilson protested, though his objection sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Interfering with injustice is not a crime, Thomas, Martha said gently. It's a duty. Later that evening, under the pretext of bringing food to the prisoner, Martha and Doc gained access to the small jail where Dakota was being held. Sheriff Wilson, after much internal struggle, had provided the key before conveniently finding business at the other end of town. Dakota listened in silence as Martha explained the map's significance, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. My mother's people spoke of this valley, he finally said. They called it the place of meeting waters, not just for the creek branches, but for the people who agreed to share its bounty. Then you knew? Doc asked, surprised. I knew stories, Dakota corrected. Now I see proof. His finger traced the boundaries of the joint settlement zone. This explains much about why I was drawn here. Martha leaned forward. Can this help you tomorrow? Harrington will make the final trial impossible. A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. Nothing is impossible to one who has already decided the outcome that matters. He studied the map again. Thank you for this truth. It confirms what must be done. And what is that? Doc asked. Dakota carefully rolled the map and returned it to Martha. Redemption, he replied, for the creek and its people. As Martha and Doc left the jailhouse, they found Ellen Collins waiting in the shadows. Is it true? She asked quietly. About the land. As true as the stars, Martha confirmed, surprising herself with the poetic turn. This valley was meant for harmony, not empire. Ellen's eyes shone with unshed tears. My mother used to tell stories about settlers and natives sharing harvests, about women from both peoples becoming friends. I thought they were just tales. Some tales are just memories waiting to be remembered, Martha replied, placing a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. Now go home, child. Tomorrow will ask much of us all. The copper compass gleamed in James Harrington's palm, its needle quivering slightly before settling on north, an heirloom from his grandfather, a man who had crossed the Cumberland Gap with nothing but determination, and this small instrument of navigation. It represented the Harrington legacy of finding direction where others saw only wilderness. 3 peaks, Harrington explained to the assembled crowd, gesturing toward the distant mountains. The contestants will depart from here, reach all 3 markers, and return before sunset. He held up the compass for all to see. Each man receives identical provisions, and 1 compass, first to complete the course wins. The morning sun cast long shadows across the eastern plain, where townspeople and ranch hands had gathered. The final trial had drawn the largest audience yet, with nearly the entire population of Redemption Creek in attendance. Martha Jenkins and her quiet allies stood together, the small river stones clutched in their palms like talismans. Victor Harrington strutted near the starting line, dressed in expensive riding clothes, despite the fact that this challenge was to be completed on foot. Hope you're good at walking, Apache, he called to Dakota. It's 30 miles round trip through rough country. Dakota stood quietly, examining the provisions laid out for each contestant, a small sack of jerky hard-tack biscuits and a single canteen of water. He lifted one of the canteens, noting its weight. Water seems light for a day's journey in this heat, he observed. Endurance means making do with what you have, Harrington replied smoothly. A skill I'm sure you're familiar with. Doc Miller stepped forward. I should check the medical supplies they're carrying. No need, Harrington countered. My men have handled everything. Sheriff Wilson, standing nearby, caught Doc's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The doctor's suspicions were warranted. Ellen Collins, permitted to attend under guard, approached the edge of the starting area. This is madness, she said, loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. Sending men into the wilderness with inadequate water is asking for tragedy. No one asked for your assessment, Miss Collins, Harrington replied coldly. Victor has completed this course before. He knows how to manage his resources. I'm sure he does, Martha Jenkins remarked. Especially when he knows where additional supplies might be waiting. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Harrington's expression hardened momentarily before he forced a smile. Suspicious minds see conspiracy where there is only fair challenge. Shall we begin? At Harrington's signal, his foreman distributed the compasses. Victor received his with barely a glance, clearly familiar with the route. When Dakota was handed his, he studied it briefly before returning it to the foreman. "I have no need of this," he said. Victor laughed, planning to navigate by communing with spirit animals. The sun, stars, wind, and land provide direction to those who listen. Dakota replied evenly, "Your grandfather's compass merely confirms what nature already reveals." Harrington's eyes narrowed at the reference to his grandfather. "Your choice," he said, pocketing the returned compass, "though refusing tools seems unwise for such a journey." "I'll use my own tools," Dakota responded. With minimal ceremony, the competition began. Victor set off at a rapid pace toward the first peak. Clearly confident in his route, Dakota moved more deliberately, pausing at the edge of the plain to examine the landscape before choosing his direction. "He's going the wrong way," one of Harrington's men commented, as Dakota headed at an angle different from Victor's direct approach. "Perhaps," Sheriff Wilson mused, "or perhaps he sees something we don't." As the competitors disappeared from view, the crowd began to disperse. Some returned to town, while others prepared to wait for the conclusion. Harrington invited the more prominent citizens to a picnic lunch under canopies set up for the occasion. "Seems confident, doesn't he?" Doc Miller remarked to Martha as they watched Harrington holding court. "Men like James only show confidence," Martha replied. "What they feel inside is another matter entirely." Throughout the day, riders positioned at each peak returned with reports. Victor had reached the first marker in good time. Dakota had taken a longer route, but arrived shortly after. For the second peak, the reports were similar. It was at the third marker that the pattern changed. The rider returned with news that Victor had arrived and departed promptly, heading back toward the ranch. Of Dakota, there was no sign. "Seems your Apache friend has either gotten lost or recognized his limitations," Harrington announced to the waiting crowd, unable to hide his satisfaction. Ellen approached Sheriff Wilson, concern evident in her expression. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. "Dakota wouldn't simply give up." "No," Wilson agreed, his hand resting on his badge with newfound resolve. "And I don't think he has." As the afternoon waned, a dust cloud on the horizon announced a rider approaching at speed. The crowd's attention turned eastward, expecting to see Victor triumphant. Instead, it was one of the course markers, his horse lathered with exertion. "Mr. Harrington," the rider called, dismounting in haste. "There's been an accident. Your son's canteen. It was tainted. He's fevered and unable to continue." Harrington's composed facade cracked. "What? Where is he?" "Near Cougar Ridge. The Apache found him collapsed. He's bringing him back now." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Harrington's face drained of color, whether from concern for his son or the disruption of his plans remained unclear. "Tainted water?" Doc Miller repeated, exchanging knowing glances with Martha. "How unfortunate that Victor would receive such a canteen." "Yes," Martha replied softly, "particularly when it was meant for someone else." The iron key to Elaine's chains lay forgotten in the dust as chaos erupted across Harrington's ranch. What had begun as a spectacle of dominance had transformed into a scene of confusion as Dakota emerged from the eastern trail, supporting a stumbling Victor Harrington. The young man's face was flushed with fever, his expensive riding clothes soaked with sweat. "Get Doc Miller," Sheriff Wilson shouted, helping Dakota lower Victor onto a blanket hastily spread beneath the nearest canopy. James Harrington pushed through the crowd, his composed facade cracking at the sight of his son. "What happened?" he demanded, directing the question at Dakota with naked hostility. Poison, Dakota replied simply. In his water, I found him collapsed 2 miles from the third marker. Doc Miller knelt beside Victor, checking his pulse and peeling back an eyelid. Symptoms suggest Jimson weed or something similar. He needs my supplies from town immediately. Harrington's foreman stepped forward. There were medicinal herbs in the emergency kit at each checkpoint. He never reached the supplies at the third peak, Dakota explained, and the kit at the second had been emptied. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Martha Jenkins exchanged knowing glances with several townspeople clutching river stones in their palms. You expect us to believe this convenient story? Harrington snapped, though his eyes never left his son's trembling form. More likely you did this to him. If I wished him harm, Dakota replied evenly, I would have left him to die in the sun. Sheriff Wilson stood, brushing dust from his knees. Someone sabotaged those supplies, James, and it wasn't Dakota, since he's the one who brought your boy back. He could have staged it, Victor's voice rasped suddenly, his eyes fever-bright but lucid. I was winning. He couldn't bear to lose. Save your strength, son, Harrington counseled, his hand uncharacteristically gentle on Victor's brow. I know what I drank, Victor insisted, trying to rise before falling back. My own canteen. The water tasted wrong. Doc Miller looked up sharply. The canteens were issued to both contestants from the same source. The foreman nodded uncomfortably. Yes, sir, I filled them myself. And who had access to them afterward? The doctor pressed. They were kept in the tack room until the trial began, the foreman admitted. But only ranch hands were allowed in there. Harrington's expression darkened. Are you suggesting someone on my payroll poisoned my son? I'm suggesting, Doc Miller replied carefully, that someone intended to poison Dakota and made a mistake. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Several of Harrington's men shifted uneasily, hands moving toward weapons. Enough speculation, Harrington declared. Get Victor to the house. Send riders for medicines. He turned to Dakota with cold fury. This contest isn't finished. I believe it is. Martha Jenkins stepped forward, her voice carrying surprising strength. Dakota brought your son back alive when he could have left him. He's proven his character beyond any trial you could devise. The rules, Harrington began. The rules changed when someone tried to kill one of the contestants, Sheriff Wilson interrupted, standing straighter than he had in years. His hand rested on his holstered revolver, not as a threat, but as a reminder of his authority. As Sheriff of Redemption Creek, I'm declaring this contest concluded. You forget yourself, Thomas, Harrington said softly. Dangerously. No, Wilson replied. I'm remembering myself. Finally, the tension stretched taut as bowstring between the two men. Around them the crowd had grown still, witnessing a confrontation many had thought impossible, the sheriff standing against Harrington in public. Ellen Collins seized the moment to slip past her distracted guards. She approached Dakota, who stood watchful but composed amidst the brewing storm. The chains, she whispered, showing him the key she had retrieved from the dirt. This is our chance. As ranch hands carried Victor toward the main house, and attention focused on the standoff between Harrington and the sheriff. Ellen and Dakota moved quietly to the wagon where the chains still hung from the wheel. The symbolic act of removing them would be lost on no one. You're choosing a dangerous path, Dakota warned her as she worked the key into the lock. I chose it the moment I said no to Victor Harrington, she replied, the lock clicking open. The chains fell to the ground with a heavy finality. He won't let this stand, Dakota cautioned, glancing toward Harrington, who remained locked in silent confrontation with the sheriff. Then he'll learn what it means to face people who are no longer afraid. Ellen answered, the discarded chains a symbol of more than just her personal freedom. Martha Jenkins had been gradually gathering her allies. Those holding river stones now stood together, a small but unified group of townspeople bearing witness. Doc Miller worked over Victor, but kept glancing toward the growing confrontation. You've been appointed sheriff by territorial authority, Harrington reminded Wilson, his voice pitched to carry. An authority that can be persuaded to reconsider its choices. Wilson's weathered face showed the strain of his decision, but his voice remained steady. Then let them reconsider. But today, in this place, the law says this contest is over. Takoda has fulfilled his obligation by bringing help to a man in need, even his competitor. The law says what Harrington stopped abruptly, as he noticed Ellen standing free beside the Apache, the chains lying broken at her feet. His expression hardened into something beyond anger, a cold calculation that was far more dangerous. So it's mutiny then, he said quietly. The woman, the Apache, the sheriff, even my loyal townspeople. His gaze swept over Martha and her group. Very well. Remember you chose this. With a curt gesture to his remaining men, Harrington turned and walked toward the main house, where Victor had been taken. Over his shoulder, he called back, "Sheriff, I expect all trespassers off my property within the hour. After that, my men will consider them hostile." As Harrington disappeared into his house, the discarded chains gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a small victory, but one that had come at the cost of declaring open conflict with the most powerful man in the territory. The weathered cedar flute produced a haunting melody that drifted through the hidden canyon where the people of Redemption Creek had taken refuge. Takoda's fingers moved over the instrument's surface with practiced ease, drawing forth notes that seemed to speak directly to the gathering darkness. The flute had belonged to his uncle, a man known for healing with both herbs and music, who had taught a young Takoda that some wounds required medicine beyond what eyes could see. "It's beautiful," Ellen said softly, seated beside him on a fallen log. "I've never heard anything like it." "My people believe music speaks to spirits," Takoda explained, lowering the flute, "both those around us and those within us." The makeshift camp spread before them, illuminated by several small fires. Nearly 30 townspeople had chosen to follow Sheriff Wilson rather than return to Redemption Creek under Harrington's shadow. They had retreated to this narrow canyon, a place Takoda knew from his explorations, where steep walls provided protection and a spring offered clean water. Doc Miller moved among the refugees, tending to an elderly couple exhausted by the hasty exodus. Martha Jenkins organized food supplies, transforming the few provisions they'd managed to bring into a communal meal. Preacher Collins led a small prayer circle, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I never thought I'd see this," Sheriff Wilson remarked, joining Takoda and Eileen by the fire. He had removed his badge, the silver star now tucked inside his shirt pocket, rather than pinned to his chest. Half the town choosing uncertainty over Harrington's false security. "People remember freedom when they see others claim it," Takoda observed. "Or when they see their sheriff finally stand up," Eileen added, causing Wilson to look away in mingled shame and pride. 20 years I wore this badge," Wilson reflected. "Watched Harrington take over bit by bit. Told myself I was maintaining order by not opposing him." "Fear makes convincing arguments," Takoda said, neither condemning nor absolving. Martha approached, carrying tin cups of coffee. "We need to discuss tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Harrington won't let this stand. He'll bring men from his other properties, perhaps even petition the governor for territorial rangers." "On what grounds?" Wilson asked. "Insurrection. Theft of property. Whatever story serves him," Martha replied. "The truth has never troubled James Harrington when it conflicts with his interests." As if summoned by her assessment, Preacher Collins joined their circle, his Bible clutched against his chest. "I've been praying for guidance," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety etched on his face. "For too long I counseled acceptance of injustice in the name of peace." "We all did, in our ways," Martha acknowledged. The preacher opened his Bible to a marked page. "But I'm reminded that there are times when standing against evil is our duty. Spoke up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy." Dakota studied the old man with newfound respect. Wise words from any tradition. They are, the preacher agreed. But words must become actions. My daughter showed more courage in one moment of defiance than I've shown in years of sermons. Ellen reached for her father's hand. You're here now. That's what matters. A commotion at the canyon entrance interrupted their conversation. Two young men who had volunteered as lookouts hurried into camp. Riders coming from town, one reported breathlessly. About a dozen men, heavily armed. Sheriff Wilson stood immediately. Harrington's not waiting until morning. We're not ready, Martha said, concern tightening her voice. We have few weapons, no defenses prepared. Dakota rose, tucking the cedar flute into his belt. This canyon has protected my mother's people before. It will do so again. He turned to Wilson. How many can handle a rifle? Maybe 10, Wilson estimated. But we have only 6 firearms among us. Dakota nodded thoughtfully. We don't need to defeat them, only discourage them. The canyon walls create echoes that can make a few sound like many. As the camp mobilized with urgent purpose, Dakota led Wilson and several others to defensive positions along the canyon's narrow entrance. Natural stone formations provided cover while offering clear lines of sight to the approach. Place your people here, here and there, Dakota instructed, indicating positions that maximize their limited numbers. Fire only on my signal, and aim above their heads for the first volley. Warning shots? Wilson questioned. Harrington's men won't be so considerate. We fight not just for today, but for tomorrow. Dakota replied. How we defend ourselves will determine what kind of community survives. As darkness deepened, the distant sound of approaching horses grew clearer. Dakota positioned himself on a high ledge overlooking the canyon entrance, the cedar flute now replaced by Eleanor's father's hunting rifle. Back at the main camp, Ellen helped organize the children and elderly in a protected alcove deeper in the canyon. As she worked, she found Martha Jenkins sitting alone, her usual resolute expression replaced by momentary uncertainty. I've lived in Redemption Creek for 40 years, the older woman confessed. Never thought I'd become a refugee in my own territory. Eleanor sat beside her. Is that what we are? Refugees? Martha considered the question, watching the determined activity around them. No, she decided finally. We're not running from something, we're moving toward something, the town we were meant to be all along. The first shots echoed through the canyon. The battle for Redemption Creek's soul had begun. Martha reached for Eleanor's hand, her grip strong despite her years. Your mother would be proud, she said quietly, of you and of what you've started. I didn't start this, Eleanor protested. You did, Martha insisted. The moment you said no to a man who'd never heard the word. Sometimes courage is contagious, child. Sometimes it only takes one person to remember their dignity for others to find theirs. Victor Harrington clutched the silver hand mirror, studying his pallid reflection with growing agitation. The ornate piece with its intricate engravings of roses and thorns had belonged to his mother, a refined Eastern woman who had withered in the harsh frontier climate, much like the delicate flowers she'd futilely attempted to grow outside their first crude cabin. I should be out there, he snarled, slamming the mirror down on his bedside table. Not lying here like some invalid while that savage makes fools of us all. His father stood at the window of Victor's bedroom, watching as a group of hired guns assembled in the ranch yard below. James Harrington's posture remained rigid, betraying none of the fury that had driven him to offer triple wages to any man willing to ride against the town's defectors. You'll stay exactly where you are, Harrington replied without turning. Doc Miller says the poison hasn't fully cleared your system. Miller's a traitor now too, Victor spat. Probably working with the Apache all along. Harrington turned then, regarding his son with cool assessment. This isn't about the Apache anymore, or even the Collins girl. This is about authority. When people see others defy power without consequences, they begin to question all manner of established order. Victor reached again for the mirror, examining the lingering yellowish tint to his eyes, evidence of the toxin that had nearly killed him. They humiliated me in front of everyone. Yes, his father acknowledged. A mistake they'll regret by morning. The foreman entered after a perfunctory knock, his expression grim. Riders are ready, Mr. Harrington. 15 men, all armed, 6 more coming from the South Range by dawn. Good, instructions are clear. Find their camp, surround it, and bring back the ringleaders Wilson, the Jenkins woman, the preacher, his daughter, and especially Apache, and the others. Harrington's expression hardened. Make examples where necessary. The rest will return to town suitably chastened. We'll handle it, the foreman assured him, though something in his eyes suggested discomfort with the orders. When they were alone again, Victor struggled to sit up straighter. I want to be there when you bring the Apache in. I want to see his face when you put him in chains. Your obsession with this man borders on unseemly, Harrington observed coldly. He's merely an obstacle to be removed, not a personal vendetta. He took what was mine, Victor insisted, his fingers tightening around the mirror's handle until his knuckles whitened. The girl was promised to me. The town respects me. Then he appears from nowhere, and suddenly everyone's questioning everything. Harrington studied his son with an expression that might have been disappointment or merely calculation. The Collins girl was never yours, merely convenient. As for respect, that's earned through power properly applied, not inherited like that mirror. Victor glanced down at the silver object in his hand, his mother's prized possession, and one of the few things Harrington had ever allowed him to claim. What does that mean? It means, Harrington said with deliberate patience, that you remain fixated on appearances rather than substance. The Apache doesn't threaten us because of some mystical influence. He threatens us because he offered an alternative to fear. He moved toward the door. A mistake I'm about to correct. I still say I should be there, Victor muttered. And I say your place is here, Harrington replied with finality. Recover your strength. There will be time enough for you to reassert yourself once order is restored. After his father departed, Victor threw back the bed covers, despite the lingering weakness in his limbs. Moving to his wardrobe, he retrieved a hidden bottle of whiskey and took a long swallow, grimacing as it burned his still sensitive throat. The silver mirror caught his eye again, reflecting a distorted image of his flushed face. In its polished surface, he saw not just himself, but his mother's delicate features, the refinement that had proven so ill-suited to frontier life. She had died when he was 12. Her final words, a whispered plea to James Harrington, promise you'll give him everything I couldn't have. His father had built an empire on that promise, using whatever means necessary to accumulate land, wealth, and influence. Yet never once had James Harrington expressed pride in his son, or suggested that Victor had earned his inheritance rather than merely being entitled to it. The Apache, though, his father had shown genuine respect for their adversary, a man who owned nothing yet carried himself as if he needed nothing. Victor hurled the mirror across the room, the glass shattering against the wall. A dozen fractured reflections stared back at him, each one showing a different angle of his fury and humiliation. Staggering to a chest beneath his window, he withdrew a wooden box containing a second set of pistols, not as ornate as his favorites, but deadly nonetheless. Checking their loading with trembling hands, he formulated his own plan. His father might be content to bring the Apache back for a public display of authority restored, but Victor required more personal satisfaction. The mirror lay in fragments, but his reflection had never been clearer. He would find Takoda himself, away from witnesses and his father's calculating pragmatism. One bullet would erase the man who had made him feel small, and with him the doubts that had taken root in Victor's mind. Outside, hoofbeats signaled the departure of his father's men. Victor tucked the pistols into his belt and reached for his coat. His legs might be unsteady and his head still swimming with poison's aftermath, but rage provided clarity where reason failed. "Never yours," he muttered, echoing his father's dismissive assessment. "We'll see about that." The pocket watch's silver case bore the dents and scratches of a lifetime service. Sheriff Wilson clicked it open. The faint tick-tick-tick barely audible above the canyon's night sounds. The timepiece had been his father's. A man who had enforced the law in Kansas Territory during bloodier days, passed down with words Wilson had long forgotten. Justice moves at its own pace, but a good lawman keeps time with the people. They'll come before dawn, Wilson observed, snapping the watch closed. Harrington knows night attacks breed confusion. Dakota nodded, crouched beside the sheriff on a ledge, overlooking the canyon entrance. The night air carried a chill that whispered of autumn's approach, and summer still held official claim to the calendar. We have the advantage of position, Dakota replied, and they don't know exactly where we are, only the general direction. Wilson gestured toward the makeshift defenses they'd established, rock slides prepared to be triggered, narrow passages where one defender could hold against several attackers. Will it be enough? It doesn't need to be permanent, Dakota said, only sufficient to make Harrington reconsider the cost. Back at the main camp, Martha Jenkins spread a rough cloth on a flat stone, arranging small stones in a pattern that mirrored the surrounding canyon landscape. Doc Miller, Preacher Collins, and several others gathered around this improvised map. 3 approaches, Martha explained, indicating narrow ravines that led to their position. The main canyon entrance here, a steep trail from the north ridge here, and a dried creek bed that enters from the southeast. How do you know this terrain so well? One of the townsmen asked. Martha's weathered hand traced the stone outline. Samuel and I picnicked in this canyon when we were courting. He called it God's own fortress, said the Apache, considered it sacred ground. Doc Miller pointed to the northern approach. This trail, it's too steep for horses. Too steep for sensible riders. Martha confirmed, but men on foot could manage it. We should position lookouts at all 3 points, Preacher Collins suggested, though we've barely enough arms to defend one properly. Ellen approached the group, carrying several bows crafted by Dakota before he left for the forward position. He said even those untrained could use these effectively, in narrow passages. Not to kill, but to deter. The assembled townspeople regarded the weapons with uncertainty until Ellen demonstrated the basic technique Dakota had shown her. Her arrow flew true enough to embed in a distant tree trunk, drawing murmurs of approval. I never imagined myself an archer at my age, Martha remarked dryly, accepting one of the bows, but necessity has made warriors of gentler souls than mine. As the group dispersed to take up positions, Ellen sought out her father, who stood apart, his Bible open though darkness made reading impossible. You should rest, she told him. You'll need your strength. The preacher closed his book with a sigh. Keep searching for guidance, but all I find are questions. Have I led my congregation astray by standing against established authority? Or did I betray them by submitting to it for so long? Perhaps both can be true, Ellen suggested gently. And perhaps forgiveness applies to ourselves as well as others. Her father's hand trembled slightly as he reached for hers. When did you become so wise? I had a good teacher, she replied with a sad smile. Mother always said that doing right rarely comes with certainty, only with necessity. Near midnight, Dakota returned to the main camp to confer with the other leaders. The stone map now included small markers representing their defensive positions and possible enemy approaches. Their scouts are probing the foothills, he reported. They'll find the main entrance by first light, but the other approaches remain hidden for now. Sheriff Wilson consulted his pocket watch again, a habit born of anxiety rather than practical need. We should move the children and elderly deeper into the canyon. There's a cavern about half a mile in that would offer protection. I'll organize it, Martha volunteered, already rising. Doc Miller cleared his throat. I've prepared what medical supplies we have, but they're meager. We should expect injuries. Dakota studied the stone map intently. There's another option beyond defense, he said finally. One that requires fewer lives risked. We're listening, Wilson prompted. Harrington wants the leaders, us. Dakota indicated those gathered around the map. The rest are merely leverage. If we could draw his forces away from the canyon entirely. You're suggesting a diversion, Elan realized. A smaller group to lead them elsewhere, while the majority remain protected here. Takoda nodded. If Harrington believes he's pursuing the main group, he'll commit his forces accordingly. That's suicide for whoever serves as bait. Doc Miller objected. Not if they know the terrain better than Harrington's men. Takoda countered. These hills hold secrets even the most experienced trackers might miss. Sheriff Wilson's fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm on his pocket watch. Who would go? I would, Takoda said simply. And anyone else willing to risk it. I'll go, Elan declared immediately. Absolutely not, her father protested. I started this, she insisted. When I refused Victor, I won't hide while others face danger on my behalf. As debate erupted around the stone map, Takoda caught Elan's eye. Behind the fear and determination he recognized something else, a clear-eyed assessment of their situation that matched his own. The coming confrontation was inevitable, but its form could still be shaped by those willing to act bold. Wilson opened his pocket watch one final time, the small circle of silver reflecting firelight like a tiny moon. 4 hours until dawn, he announced, his decision made. If we're doing this, we move within the hour. Martha gathered the stones from their map, returning the earth to its natural state. Samuel would say we're not just defending ourselves, but the very idea of what Redemption Creek was meant to be. Then let's make sure that idea survives. Wilson replied, whatever happens to us. The brass signal horn gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light as Martha Jenkins positioned herself on the high ridge overlooking the canyon's 3 entrances. The instrument had once announced the arrival of stagecoaches to Redemption Creek in more prosperous days, before Harrington's stranglehold had diverted the main route to favor his interests. 3 short blasts would warn of approach from the main entrance, 2 for the northern trail, 1 for the southeastern creek bed. Martha's breath fogged in the chill air as she scanned the shadowed landscape below. At 72, her eyes weren't what they once were, but decades on the frontier had taught her to read the land's subtle language, the unnatural movement of birds, the shifting patterns of darkness that betrayed human presence. The diversion party had departed an hour earlier. Takoda, Sheriff Wilson, and despite her father's anguished objections, Ellen Collins, they carried minimal provisions and moved like ghosts through the western ravine, intending to circle behind Harrington's approaching forces and draw them away from the canyon where the remaining townspeople sheltered. A flicker of torchlight in the distance caught Martha's attention. She narrowed her eyes, confirming the slow-moving procession of riders approaching the main canyon entrance. Raising the horn to her lips, she sounded 3 short, sharp blasts that echoed across the stone walls. Below, the remaining defenders moved into position. Doc Miller and Preacher Collins led non-combatants deeper into the protective recesses, while those willing to fight took up the positions they had prepared through the night. Bows were strung, the few rifles loaded, and trigger mechanisms set for the prepared rock slide. Martha descended carefully from her lookout, her joints protesting the strain. Age might have slowed her body, but her mind remained keen as she joined the defenders at the main entrance, a natural bottleneck where the canyon walls narrowed to barely twice the width of a wagon. 15 riders, she reported to the blacksmith, who had assumed tactical leadership in Wilson's absence. Moving cautiously, they know we're here. The blacksmith, a bear of a man named Hollister, who had once been cavalry before settling in Redemption Creek, nodded grimly. Right where we want them. Narrow passage means their numbers count for less. As dawn's first light spilled over the eastern ridge, Harrington's men came into full view. Trail-hardened cowboys and hired guns leading pack horses laden with supplies for a prolonged siege. At their head rode Harrington's foreman, his expression grim beneath the shadow of his hat brim. That's far enough, Hollister called out when the riders reached the narrowest point of the approach. This canyon is occupied by the free citizens of Redemption Creek. State your business or turn back. The foreman reined in his horse, raising an empty hand to signal his men to halt. Mr. Harrington demands the return of his property and the surrender of those who've incited rebellion. His voice carried no conviction, merely resigned professionalism. There's no property of Harrington's here, Martha replied, stepping forward despite Hollister's restraining hand. Only people who've chosen freedom over fear. Ma'am, the foreman acknowledged her with a respectful nod. Mr. Harrington specifically named you among those he once brought back. Said to tell you he's prepared to be reasonable if you influence the others to toe down. A ripple of uncertain murmurs passed through the defenders. Martha's spine straightened as she addressed not just the foreman, but her own people. I've known James Harrington for 20 years, she proclaimed, her voice carrying surprising strength. His version of reasonable means he takes everything while leaving you just enough to keep working for his benefit. Tell him Martha Jenkins is done being reasonable. The foreman sighed, genuine regret crossing his weathered features. Then I'm instructed to inform you that we'll be taking this canyon and everyone in it. Mr. Harrington has men covering all approaches. There's no escape. We're not looking to escape, Hollister responded. We're making a stand. The foreman studied the defensive positions visible from his vantage point. The archers on the ridge, riflemen behind stone barriers, and the precariously balanced boulders rigged to tumble onto the narrow passage. His assessment complete, he touched his hat brim. I'll convey your decision to Mr. Harrington. Without further comment, he turned his horse and rode back to his waiting men. He's too calm, Martha observed, as the riders withdrew to a safe distance. They've found another way in. As if summoned by her suspicion, the signal horn sounded from their secondary lookout, one long blast warning of approach from the southeastern creek bed. They're trying to flank us, Hollister realized. Split our defense. A moment later, gunfire erupted from the northern ridge. Not the two-blast warning they expected, but the actual exchange of bullets. Their lookout had been engaged directly. 3 approaches, just as we feared, Martha said, unslinging the bow Dakota had crafted. They'll try to overwhelm us from multiple directions. Hollister barked orders, redistributing their meager forces to cover the new threats. The defenders moved with the desperate efficiency of those fighting for their homes and freedom, rather than pay. As Martha took position behind a boulder overlooking the main entrance, the rising sun illuminated the canyon in golden light, revealing the full beauty of their chosen fortress. If this was to be their last stand, at least it would be in a place worthy of remembrance. The signal horn sounded once more, an urgent, sustained note that wasn't part of their established code. Martha's eyes widened as she interpreted its meaning, a new threat, unexpected and dire. On the ridge opposite her position, a lone rider appeared silhouetted against the morning sky. Even at a distance, the distinctive form of Victor Harrington was unmistakable, as was the raised rifle in his hands. He had circled behind their defenses, gaining the high ground from which he could rain down fire on the defenders below. The first shot kicked up dirt near Martha's position, followed by a second that splintered wood on the barricade beside her. Victor's weakened condition hadn't affected his marksmanship. As the defenders scattered for better cover, Martha realized their carefully prepared defense was collapsing into chaos. Harrington's multi-pronged attack had succeeded in dividing their attention and resources exactly when unity was most critical. She raised the signal horn to her lips once more, sounding the emergency call that would bring their scattered forces back to the main canyon. Whether they could regroup in time remained to be seen, but Martha Jenkins had not survived 72 years on the frontier by surrendering to despair when the odds turned against her. The sheriff's star caught the midday sun as Wilson held it in his palm, studying the 5-pointed symbol that had defined his identity for 2 decades. Tarnished and bent from where a bullet had grazed it years ago, the badge remained recognizable despite its imperfections. Much like the man who had worn it, "Never thought I'd remove this except to be buried with it," Wilson remarked to Dakota as they crouched behind a limestone outcropping. Below them spread the rear flank of Harrington's forces, 8 riders maintaining position at the canyon's western approach, while the main assault focused elsewhere. "Some symbols outlive their purpose," Dakota replied. "Others find new meaning when carried by different hands." The diversion plan had worked, perhaps too well. The distant sounds of gunfire and shouting from the canyon indicated that Harrington's attack had commenced in full force. The small diversion party, Wilson, Dakota, and Elaine, had successfully circled behind the enemy position, but now faced the challenge of drawing attention without being immediately captured or killed. "We need to create enough disturbance to pull some men away from the canyon," Wilson said, tucking the badge into his shirt pocket. "But not so much that they overwhelm us instantly." Elaine, who had proven surprisingly adept at moving quietly through the rugged terrain, pointed toward the horses picketed at the edge of the enemy camp. "Their mounts," she suggested. "Scatter them, and they'll have to pursue." Dakota nodded approval. "Divide their forces and their attention." "Good strategy." Wilson studied the terrain between their position and the horses. "That's 30 yards of open ground. We'd be exposed." "Not if they're looking elsewhere first," Dakota replied, withdrawing 3 small objects from his pouch. Smooth river stones wrapped tightly with oiled rags. Fire draws eyes. Movement escapes notice when attention is fixed. Understanding dawned on Wilson's weathered face. A distraction. Dakota struck a match, lighting the rag-wrapped stones before hurling them with remarkable accuracy toward the far side of the enemy camp. The flaming projectiles landed among dry brush, immediately igniting small blazes that quickly grew in the parched vegetation. As predicted, Harrington's men scrambled toward the fires, shouting warnings and leaving the horses momentarily unattended. Wilson and Elaine seized the opportunity, rushing forward to release the animals while Dakota provided covering fire from their elevated position. The freed horses bolted in panic, some charging directly through the camp and adding to the chaos. 2 of Harrington's men managed to grab their reins, but the others scattered into the surrounding hills. "That ought to thin their ranks," Wilson said with grim satisfaction as they retreated into the cover of a narrow ravine. "They'll have to send riders to recover those mounts." Their momentary triumph was interrupted by the distinctive report of a rifle, different from the general gunfire echoing from the canyon. A bullet struck stone inches from Elaine's head, showering her with limestone fragments. "Move," Dakota commanded, pushing them deeper into the ravine as a second shot kicked up dirt at their heels. They scrambled through the narrow passage, emerging onto a rocky slope that offered multiple routes for escape. Wilson paused, breathing heavily, his hand pressed against his side where age and a long-ago injury protested the exertion. "Someone tracked us specifically," he panted. "That wasn't random fire." "Victor," Elaine stated with certainty. "I'd recognize the sound of his fancy rifle anywhere. He hunts with it every autumn." Dakota's expression darkened. "He's recovered enough to ride, then, and to hold a grudge," Wilson added. "We should separate, divide his focus." Before they could implement this strategy, a voice called out from above them. "I only want the Apache," Victor Harrington shouted, his words echoing across the rocky terrain. "Send him out, and the rest of you can return to the canyon unharmed." Wilson instinctively reached for his badge before remembering it no longer resided on his chest. "Don't believe him, Dakota. His word's worth less than snake oil." "I know," Dakota replied calmly, "but he offers an opportunity." Ellen grasped his arm. "You can't surrender. He'll kill you." "Not surrender," Dakota corrected. "Engagement. While Victor focuses on me, you 2 can circle back to help the canyon defenders. We're not leaving you to face him alone," Wilson protested. "You're needed elsewhere," Dakota insisted. "The people in that canyon have chosen courage over comfort. They deserve leaders willing to fight beside them." Before either could object further, Dakota moved to a position where Victor could see him, though still protected by substantial cover. "I'm here, Victor Harrington," he called out, "but I won't be taken easy." Victor's response was another rifle shot that splintered rock near Dakota's position. "You've taken everything from me," he shouted, his voice carrying the edge of obsession. "My dignity, my bride, my father's respect. Took nothing that was truly yours," Dakota replied, motioning urgently for Wilson and Elaine to depart, while Victor's attention fixed on him. "A man can only lose what he genuinely possesses." Wilson hesitated, torn between loyalty to his new ally and duty to those defending the canyon. The distant gunfire had intensified, suggesting the situation there had grown dire. "Go," Tikoda urged quietly. "This is between him and me now." Elaine's eyes shone with unshed tears. "We'll bring help," she promised. "Be swift," Tikoda replied. "I'll keep him occupied." As Wilson and Elaine slipped away, utilizing a hidden game trail Tikoda had shown them, the sheriff paused for one final moment. He withdrew the tarnished star from his pocket and pressed it into Elaine's hand. "If I don't make it back," he said quietly, "give this to someone worthy of it, someone who remembers what it's supposed to mean." Tikoda, meanwhile, moved carefully from cover to cover, drawing Victor deeper into the labyrinth of stone formations. The young Harrington's obsession made him predictable, his desire for personal vengeance overriding tactical sense. "Face me like a man," Victor demanded, his voice echoing strangely in the rock-walled ravine. "I am not the man you think I am," Tikoda replied, his voice seemingly coming from multiple directions as the canyon walls caught and reflected the sound. "And you are not yet the man you could be." Another shot rang out, followed by the distinctive click of an empty chamber. Victor's frustrated curse confirmed he'd need to reload, providing a critical moment of opportunity. In that instant, as Wilson and Ellen disappeared from sight and Victor fumbled with cartridges, Tikoda felt a strange sense of completion. The path that had led him to Redemption Creek, a journey begun years ago with his mother's stories of the place of meeting waters, was reaching its culmination. The tarnished star in Ellen's hand would find its proper bearer. The people of the canyon would endure, and he would face Victor Harrington, not as an enemy, but as the mirror the young man needed, reflecting back not what he wished to see, but what he needed to recognize. James Harrington unfolded the territorial charter with careful precision, smoothing its creased surface across his saddle horn. The official document, bearing the governor's ornate signature and territorial seal, had resided in his inside coat pocket for 15 years, tangible proof of his legal authority over Redemption Creek and the surrounding lands. The parchment had yellowed with age, its edges worn from repeated handling, but the power it represented remained undiminished in Harrington's mind. "Sir, we need orders," his foreman pressed, ducking as a bullet ricocheted off nearby stone. "The canyon defenders are better positioned than we anticipated." Harrington's cold gaze swept across the chaotic scene before him. What should have been a swift reassertion of authority had devolved into a protracted standoff. His men had secured the main entrance to the canyon, but could advance no further without suffering unacceptable casualties. The element of surprise had been lost when someone, likely the Apache, had detected their flanking maneuvers. "Where's Victor?" Harrington demanded. The foreman hesitated. He rode off pursuing the Apache and the sheriff. Wouldn't listen to reason. A muscle twitched in Harrington's jaw, the only visible sign of his displeasure. "And our men at the western approach? No word since the horses scattered. We've lost at least 6 mounts." Harrington carefully refolded the charter, his movements deliberate despite the gunfire, exchanging around them. "Bring Martha Jenkins to me, alive and unharmed." "Sir, she's in the thick of their defense." "It would cost men too." "Then it costs men," Harrington interrupted. "She's the moral center of this rebellion. Break her, and the rest will follow." As the foreman reluctantly departed to relay the orders, Harrington surveyed the canyon with calculating eyes. He had built his empire through strategic thinking, analyzing vulnerabilities, applying pressure at critical points, and above all, recognizing when circumstances required compromise rather than conquest. That moment had arrived, though he loathed admitting it. Within the canyon, Martha Jenkins crouched behind a barricade of fallen timber, reloading the ancient shotgun that had protected her store during 3 decades of frontier life. Beside her, Doc Miller tended to Hollister's wounded shoulder, the blacksmith grimacing but insisting he could still fight. "They're regrouping," Martha observed, Noting the decreased gunfire from Harrington's men, something's changed. Doc tied off a bandage with practiced efficiency. They've realized we won't be easily dislodged, or they're planning something worse, Hollister countered grimly. A shout from their rear guard interrupted the moment. Riders approaching from the west. Martha's heart sank. If Harrington had brought reinforcements from his other properties, their defense would surely collapse. She rose to her knees, peering over the barricade toward the western passage. Instead of enemy reinforcements, she saw Ellen Collins and Sheriff Wilson leading a group of mounted men, not Harrington's cowboys, but miners and farmers from outlying homesteads. The cavalry they desperately needed had arrived, called by messengers Martha had sent out before the canyon had been surrounded. "Hold your fire," she shouted, as the newcomers thundered into the canyon. "They're with us." The reinforcements swiftly integrated into the defensive positions, their fresh energy and additional firearms immediately strengthening the resistance. Sheriff Wilson, though clearly exhausted, moved among the defenders with renewed purpose. Ellen found Martha behind the barricade. Dakota stayed behind, she explained breathlessly. "Victor was hunting us. He drew him away so we could reach you." Before Martha could respond, a white flag appeared at the canyon entrance, held aloft by Harrington's foreman. The gunfire gradually ceased as both sides registered the universal signal for parley. "James wants to talk," Sheriff Wilson observed, joining them. "That's new. Talk, or dictate terms." Martha wondered aloud. "Only one way to find out," Wilson replied, checking his revolver before stepping into the open. "Cover me." As Wilson approached the canyon entrance, James Harrington himself emerged from behind his men's positions, the territorial charter visible in his hand. The two men met in the neutral ground between the opposing forces, their conversation inaudible to those watching from either side. After several minutes of animated discussion, Wilson returned to the defenders, his expression unreadable. "Harrington proposes a truce," he announced. "He's willing to recognize our right to remain in the canyon unmolested while territorial authorities review competing claims to the land." "He's stalling," Hollister objected, "buying time until more men arrive." "Maybe," Wilson acknowledged, "but he's also offered hostages to guarantee his good faith. Himself and his foreman will remain with us while negotiations proceed." Martha's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "James Harrington doesn't compromise unless he sees advantage in it." "There's more," Wilson continued. "Victor's missing. Harrington's concerned his son may have done something rash. He's asking for our help to find him and the Apache." A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed this unexpected development. The standoff had evolved beyond a simple conflict over authority into something more complex and potentially tragic. "If Victor's hunting Dakota with blood in his eye," Doc Miller said quietly, "we need to find them before it's too late." Martha Jenkins studied the weary faces around her, neighbors who had found courage they never knew they possessed, standing together against seemingly insurmountable odds. The charter in Harrington's hand might carry the territory's seal, but these people carried something more powerful, the communal spirit that had founded Redemption Creek before greed corrupted its promise. "We'll help find them," she decided, not for Harrington's sake, but for Dakota's, and for what this town might yet become. As the sun reached its zenith, casting the shortest shadows of the day, the defenders of the canyon and their former opponents prepared to set aside their immediate conflict for a more urgent mission. Whether this unexpected cooperation would lead to lasting peace, or merely a brief interlude in their struggle, remained to be seen. What was certain, as Martha tucked her shotgun under her arm and prepared to join the search party, was that Redemption Creek stood at a crossroads that would determine not just who controlled the land, but what values would shape its future.